So I'll perhaps talk about a few themes before I answer the questions, because I think that's often quite useful, and some of the questions have quite similar, so I'll probably be able to answer some of the questions by having a bit of a chat first. So we've got this wonderful announcement that we're going to move to level 3 from next, it'll be Tuesday effectively, won't it, for at least 2 weeks, and then we'll be reviewing it. So under level 3, we still need to remember that there's the first position is that people need to work at home. They're required to work at home unless it's not possible. So that's our starting point. And then, of course, workplaces, some can open, but they can only open if the workers can't work from home and if the workplaces can operate safely, and customers aren't allowed on premises, and that the businesses can trade without physical contact. So that's where all of the online orders and click and collect, etc., has come in. There's an awful lot of businesses that rely on doing things, if you want to describe it that way, and construction is one of those, contracting, those types of areas. So they will have to be really careful that they meet those requirements when they are operating. And so we're sort of stuck in the position again where there's lots of different categories that different businesses fall into. Some can return to work who haven't been working. Some it's business as usual because they have been operating. Others can't return to work still. So for those that can return to work, look, the lucky ones will have the same amount of work that they used to, but by far the largest group of those who can return to work are not going to have as much work, or that's what we're hearing. So they're in the position of building up their work or dealing with loss of work, or a combination of both, and the uncertainty of the economy. So a lot of what we're dealing with those types of businesses are discussions around reduced hours and reduced pay, notwithstanding the fact that they are returning to work, or it might be phrased actually as an increase in pay from where there's been employees at home doing no work at all. But it's better if reduced hours and reduced pay can go hand in hand, i.e. that they're relative to each other. It's more difficult when we've got situations where people are wanting to reduce pay but want their staff to work as much as they otherwise would have. Important to remember once again, as those of you who have been on these sessions before have heard me rant on about, and I will not stop doing so, that you need a process to do these things. These processes generally are one of consultation, putting a proposal, hearing feedback from staff, and then going on to make a decision. But what we are seeing is that a lot of staff are starting to see the reality of not having received their full pay for the last month. So we're getting a bit of pushback. And unfortunately, in some cases where staff have been paid and wage subsidy and topped up to 80%, say, then they kind of got paid quite a lot to do nothing, and now you want them to work, and that's a bit hard as well. So that's coming back to bite a little bit, even though these employers were absolutely doing everything they could to do the right thing. So we've got a bit more pushback is what we're seeing from staff. So it's even more important, in my view, that we make sure that the processes are right, because as you'll know, if you don't get it right, then that's where we trigger personal grievances. And that at a time like this would be a bit of a disaster, really, having to, just in terms of the cost of it and the time of it, you want to be focusing on your business and getting it up and running. So those who are returning to work will also be needing to think about the health and safety requirements. The other thing that essential services have been struggling with during this lockdown has been getting some staff to come to work. And that's something that we will see as more and more businesses get up and running. Although hopefully with the number of COVID cases reducing, that fear is less amongst the staff, but that issue will still crop up. For people who can't return to work, well, you might simply be continuing on with the same working arrangements that you've had in place for lockdown. But what we're also seeing is that some of those employers who have been trying to pay their staff will find it more difficult to continue to do that. And whether that was at 100%, 80% or 60% or whatever it was that they put in place, that is getting, the longer that you can't work, the harder that becomes. And so that's the conversation that we're having with a lot of those businesses. So there might be another process there that needs to happen around reducing pay. And of course, still gearing up for level 2, because that will be the big goal for these businesses, and gearing up for the health and safety requirements in particular is a good area to focus. So that health and safety planning is really important to make sure that effective controls are in place to address COVID. And to make sure that you are meeting your usual obligations to ensure the health and safety of your workers and others who come to the business. So there will be, just those same key controls that we've been hearing about throughout, about keeping people with symptoms away, making sure that the separation distances are enforced and in a structured way. The disinfecting of surfaces, the good hygiene, the coughing into the elbows, the washing the hands, all of those things which we're all a little bit, have heard a million times, are all still the things that we need to be focusing these things on, alongside things like contact tracing, making sure that that's facilitated. So, you need to develop a COVID safety plan, and that will serve as a record of how you're going to reduce the risk of COVID, and it will also demonstrate that you can operate safely, which is one of the requirements of going back to work. So that's going to deal with a whole raft of things, those things that I've mentioned, but the risks from restarting your business, how you're keeping the workers safe, and managing exposure to COVID. And a lot of industries are working really proactively on guidance, so look to your own industry. There's a lot out there about what needs to be done, and that's a really useful source too. And then probably the final thing that we're seeing is a lot of discussions about redundancy. So a lot are saying, look, we probably would have made some staff redundant if not for the wage subsidy. So, in that respect, the wage subsidy has had the effect that they intended it to keep people employed, because if you can't pay more than the wage subsidy, you can still just pass that wage subsidy on. So that has held off those discussions, but we are having a lot more of those types of discussions. And when you think about, once again, we need a process for a restructure, and really the timeframes, that's a lot more serious. It's someone losing their position. We need to remember that there's timeframes involved in a process, and then their notice running. So if people are thinking, well, when the subsidy ends, I'm going to have real trouble paying staff, depending on the state of the business and whether you're able to operate or not. Then you'll need to think about how long is the notice before the date after which you can't really pay them. How long is the notice period, because you want that to run, and how long does it take for a process? And so if you've got someone with a full week notice period, then you're going to need to be looking at that kind of 6 weeks before you are going to have a problem with paying that person. So just remember to keep those timeframes in mind, because it will sneak up on you when you're talking about, 6 weeks is a heck of a long time, and we haven't even had 6 weeks in lockdown. So yeah, really good to be having those conversations now, as many are. So we'll turn to some of the questions. So first question, we have a worker who has health issues and would be classed as vulnerable. Before lockdown, they were advised to self-isolate by the doctor. Recently, it indicates he might want to come back to work under level 3, which is probably for financial reasons. How do we approach this, and can we ask him to get a medical certificate saying he's fit for work? Yes, that's a good idea. Because if they've had medical advice prior to lockdown that they are a person at risk, then that's a really good thing to protect you as a business, to now have on the other side a medical certificate saying that it's okay for them to come to work. The other thing is, whether there are any conditions associated with that, whether they can only come to work in certain circumstances. And it may actually be in some cases that it's actually safer for some workers to come to work in level 3 than it is in level 2, because there's no customers if you've got customers based work. So these things might change and sort of become quite fluid. So that's something to be aware of. The same person has also asked that they've been paying staff 80% of their normal wage for 4 weeks. If he is in fact unable to return for medical reasons, can we only pay him the $5.85 subsidy amount? Yeah, so this is a little bit linked to the essential worker leave scheme. So they brought that essential worker leave scheme in to deal with the businesses who hadn't applied for the wage subsidy, where they had people who were sick with COVID or had to self-isolate, or who were immune compromised or in a bubble with any of those people. And so that's quite useful to apply that to people who were not essential workers as well, and we've been doing that as a bit of a rule. So if you've already applied for the wage subsidy, you can't go and double dip into the other one, but you can apply the same principles. So it's sort of got endorsement from the government, I suppose, is what I'm saying, is that if someone is immune compromised, then you can pass on the wage subsidy to them for that. If they've got other entitlements like leave or anything like that that they want to use, then they could use that if you agree as well. Next question, what do we need to do to ensure physical distancing, contact tracing and hygiene or sanitisation of the workplace? This is really going to depend on what your workplace is, really, and a lot of it comes down to planning and a lot of, I suppose, common sense and following the directions in a lot of the COVID publications which are now available. So in terms, contact tracing is something that the government is concerned to ensure happens. So things like registers of people that come to your business, which will be a lot easier under level 3, but are things that people going into level 2 should think about too. They talk about regularly sanitising, so it's going to depend on what level of traffic is happening and what is happening within your workplace, but really and having things like sanitizer around, and thinking about things like when people come into the workplace, what have you got in place to make sure that they are able to wash their hands or sanitize or that type of thing. So what I'm saying to people is, if you just think about what an ordinary worker is going to do when they arrive at work and during the course of their work, and the ways in which there might be COVID type hazards, and then try to work through addressing those, is a really good way of doing that. Next question, what is the best space to person ratio to work within this new environment? So for level 3, they're saying that 1 metre in the workplace and 2 metres outside. I think, I understand that the theory behind that is that the workplace is a controlled environment, and alongside that measure and some other measures, the workplace would also be controlling people with symptoms from coming in, and making sure that other workers, when workers have COVID-like symptoms, they don't come to work, for example, so that they can maintain that 1 metre distance, whereas the 2 metre is more, well, you don't know who on earth you're coming across type approach. So that's what the guidance is there. Do we need to create a new COVID-19 health and safety plan for alert level 2? Yes, so your risks are going to change depending on different levels, and they're going to be different things that you need to do. Some of the fundamental stuff that we've talked about, like sanitising and hand washing and stuff, is not going to change, but there will be likely differences. So that's something to be cognizant of. It will also be very specific to your workplace, and as I said before, thinking through how things actually work and what people will be doing when they're in the workplace, so that you can help to identify that. Have our employer obligations changed since COVID-19, either increased or decreased, and how? So the essential obligations are the same. So those are our health and safety obligations that we've always had. So as I said before, to ensure the health and safety of your workers, we've just got the introduction of this additional causal element that we're dealing with. So if you apply the same principles that you always have, that, you know, where possible, eliminate, and if not, you know, then if that's not possible, minimise, etc. Then that's your same obligation. So you probably feel like your obligations have increased because you're having to do a lot around COVID at the moment, and so that's an additional layer. But in general, your same responsibilities apply. It's just you've got this other big topic to deal with at the moment. And so it will require PCBUs to do more than what they have been. And remember too, the obligation to consult and coordinate with other PCBUs. So that, you know, when we're talking about your safety plan, making sure that you're working in with suppliers and contractors and things like that. Think of the contractors who come to your premises, for example, or suppliers or that type of thing, and checking what their processes are. You know, the obvious one being the cleaners. You'll have an interest in making sure that the cleaners have got a proper regime that will address COVID. Most of the cleaners are being quite proactive in letting businesses know what they're doing, but that's one that's worth checking in with, a pretty important one. And keeping a record of these things. So as I said before, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can operate safely. So if somehow you've got a record that you, even if it's a checklist or just some emails, that you've ticked off all of these things, then that helps. One thing we always find in this area is that if you've got documentation, it's really useful should you be challenged or you know, worse down the track, end up in a prosecution. There's, you know, your documentation is really, really important. Next question. We've received the wage subsidy. Is it still appropriate to go through a restructure if we might make staff redundant through that? And if so, how do we protect the interests of New Zealand workers when we have quite a few people on work visas? So dealing with the first aspect first, so there is this obligation linked to the declaration for wage subsidy to retain staff for that 12-week period. And it was phrased as using best endeavours. So best endeavours doesn't mean you have to do everything, including letting the business fail. So there is some wriggle room there, but also circumstances change and things develop. And so there is scope to deal with redundancies when you have applied for the wage subsidy. Now, in terms of what happens if you then make people redundant, the wage subsidy becomes the issue because you've made this declaration. So some of the government guidance says that you would need, or suggests that you would need to pay that back. So if you've got someone who you've made redundant, their notice period expires, and say you've got 4 weeks left to go on the wage subsidy, then it would be that element of it. We have also had some communications with managers in MSD who are administering it that you don't need to pay it back, and that you can just use it to apply to other staff. Now, that's all a little bit complicated and confusing. So what we think is best is, if you are in that situation, go back to MSD, explain the situation, and ask what they would like you to do with that money. So ring fence it and ask MSD, and then you will know that you are meeting government requirements. So that is what I would suggest, and you just need, it's quite a tricky balance in terms of a restructure during the wage subsidy. So happy to talk to you about that more if that's something that you feel that you need to do. In terms of the New Zealand workers aspect, that's pretty tricky as well, because you've got a prohibition against discrimination. So if they're non-New Zealanders, if I can use that category, then you can't discriminate on the basis of nationality and a bunch of other things. So that would be really tricky. You would need to be pretty careful. So it might be that there are some other, actually when you drill down into it, that there's actually some other criteria that are relevant that you might focus on. So yeah, you've got to be really careful if that's how you're going to roll with that one. Another question, if an employee currently earns above the wage subsidy, but by reducing them to 80%, they go below the wage subsidy, should the full wage subsidy go to the employee, or can a reduced amount be paid to them to reflect 80%? So what we're talking about there is, so they've earned more than the wage subsidy and then they're going to end up under it. So yeah, so there's if they're going to, the safest way is probably just to pass on the wage subsidy because of the declaration that you're going to pass it on. There is an exception with that wage subsidy to that if they normally earned less than the wage subsidy, which is not what's been suggested here, then you only have to pay them the amount that they did earn. So say they used to earn $300 and they're on the part-time, and you've got a $350 subsidy for them as a part-time worker, then you can only pay them, you only have to pay them the $300. So there's, yeah, that one's probably a bit of a tricky one. Probably have to look at it in the specifics in more detail, but that's really what I just outlined is really the only exception for not passing on the full wage subsidy. So you're best to pass it on if you can. Another question, if all employees are being reduced to 80%, but there's one employee who earns $500 when they work for their part-time hours, normally, can we ask that person to keep working 100% to receive their 500? That can be tricky if you start to deal with staff differently. What we've found is the best way is if we're sort of all in this together and everyone gets the same formula. You do have an obligation to treat staff consistently, and so it would be the safer course to just apply that 80% to everybody, unless there's some sort of objective reason to justify it. For example, you might need the accounts person to keep working all of their full hours or something, and then just be open about it, so that, and as long as there's not another person in the same role, for example. So it really does depend on the circumstances, but that might be some ways that you could manage it. Could an employer consult with employees to reduce their pay to 80%, but ask that they continue to work 100%? Yeah, that's trickier, as I said at the beginning, than reducing hours and pay. So when someone asks me, can we reduce their pay to 80%, but we don't want to change the hours that they work, I do test that with people, because we usually find that the reason we're wanting to reduce their pay is because we're suffering some kind of a loss. or loss of revenue. And so that often ends up that we actually are doing less work. Now, it's not always, but sometimes when you think it through, then you do realise that that we can actually say, well, they are working a bit less, and tie the two. So if you can tie the two together, I really think you should. It's much easier to get that past your employees. It's a hard sell to say you've got to work as much, but we're going to pay you less. But there are circumstances in which we've done that. And sometimes it applies more to upper management, where you find that actually you're going to need them to work just as much, but you need everyone to take a pay cut to get through it. And there are different ways that we have dealt with that in terms of deferment or other sort of options that they're getting themselves into to try and lessen that. And you've got to be really, really careful about your process and your justification if that's where you're going to go. I mean, there might be some objectively reasonable way. For example, if you are subject to rates that are set by a third party and those rates are decreased, but you're still having to do the same amount of work, then that might be a good justifiable reason as to why you might be reducing pay. And when you think of it as being an alternative to redundancy, then that's better as well. So yeah, it's tricky, and it's something that you need to be really, really careful about. Just looking at the time, I probably got time for just one more question. We don't have the same amount of work when we return, and I want to try and be as fair as I can about giving staff work. How am I best to do that? Yeah, that's a question that we're talking to a lot of people about. The most fair, as in when we were talking about the pay side of things, is to try and treat everyone the same and try to give everyone the same amount of work if you can. Now, that's going to vary from role to role, obviously, and there are lots of different ways, and it depends on your business and what your operational requirements are. But some it works to just say everyone's going to work such and such % of their time or however many days. Others are, you know, to deal with separation and also to address spread of anything. Some are breaking into teams. Now that's teams who then go and work in different locations, or teams who work different periods of time. And some, because of the, you know, to try and reduce the any spread and to deal with the cleaning, some are going week on, week off, and then swapping around. Others are doing mornings and then afternoons for others, but that's got a cleaning element in between usually. So yeah, I think those are different ways of doing the same thing, which is trying to be, probably the most fair is to try and give the people the same amount of work. I was talking with one client today and we were talking about overtime. And really, if you get overtime after X amount of hours a week, then you really should be managing the time so that you shouldn't be having some triggering overtime and others only getting 10 hours a week or something. And that's actually not that great for the business anyway, if you've got staff who on normal hours who aren't working, and then you end up paying overtime. So it's something that employers are going to really need to carefully manage, and work volumes are going to vary from week to week. There's quite a few who are saying we've got a bit of work for the next wee while because we had it there when we went into lockdown, but we don't know how fast the new work's going to come in. So it will vary, and so you need to set it up carefully, any working regime, so that you've got that flexibility to require workers to work when you need them to, but to not be obliged to when you don't have the work, and that's quite a delicate exercise. So we've run over time, so I better not take up too much more of your time, but thanks for all of your questions. Hopefully they've answered a lot of your concerns that you've had pressing at the moment. You all know where we are, so happy to help by phone or email or any way else you can get a message to us, courier pigeon. So yeah, please pick up the phone if you do have any concerns, or if you just want to run past an idea, because these are different times and it's hard, you know, there's no textbooks on this. So it's really falling back on employment law principles and applying them to this new world we're in. So good luck with the decisions you're making in your business, and sing out if you need any help. Good luck. See you all.